Pay attention to this hospital surveillance footage from May 2003. You're looking at the emergency room entrance of St. Mary's Hospital in Tampa, Florida. It's just after midnight. An ambulance has just arrived with a young woman who was found dying on the roadside. Now watch the man in the orange jacket who arrives about 20 minutes later. He's carrying a small child. He says he's the victim's husband. He says her name is Jessica Williams. But here's what makes this footage so chilling. That man is lying about everything. His name isn't what he claims. That child he's holding isn't his son, and the woman fighting for her life in that emergency room? She's been living under a stolen identity for years. What investigators are about to uncover will reveal a crime so twisted, so layered with deception, that it will take decades to untangle. And the deeper they dig, the worse it gets. You ever wonder about the people you pass on the street? The woman working at the coffee shop, the guy pumping gas next to you. Everyone has a story, right? A past, a real name, a family somewhere. But what if everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie? What if the person standing next to you had no past at all? Or at least, not one they could talk about? On May 3, 2003, a 27-year-old woman was found lying on the side of Highway 19 in Tampa, Florida. She'd been hit by a car and left for dead. Witnesses called 911. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital. She was barely clinging to life. When her husband showed up at the hospital with their young son, he told doctors her name was Jessica Williams. He seemed distraught, worried like any husband would be. But nothing about that night was what it seemed. This is the story of a woman who lived her entire life under false names. A story about identity theft, abuse, and a predator who got away with the unthinkable for decades, and it all started with a hit and run on a Florida highway. Let me take you back to that night in May 2003. It was around 11:30 p.m. when drivers on Highway 19 started calling 911. There was a woman lying in the road, clearly injured, barely conscious. Someone had hit her and just kept driving. When paramedics arrived, they found a young woman in her 20s with severe head trauma. She was wearing a cocktail dress and heels, the kind of outfit you'd wear to work at an upscale bar or club. No purse, no ID, no phone. She was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize her. The injuries were catastrophic. Skull fracture, internal bleeding, broken ribs. Whoever hit her had been going fast, and they hadn't even slowed down. About 20 minutes after she arrived, a man walked into the emergency room carrying a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The man was in his 40s, kind of disheveled, clearly upset. He told the nurses he was looking for his wife. She hadn't come home from work, and he was worried something had happened. When they showed him the woman who'd been brought in from the highway, he broke down. Yes, that was her. That was Jessica, his wife, the mother of his son. The man introduced himself as Warren Williams. He said they'd been married for about 3 years. Jessica worked as a dancer at a gentleman's club downtown. She'd been on her way home from work when this happened. Doctors told Warren that Jessica's injuries were severe. They were doing everything they could, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Warren stayed at the hospital with their son, Michael. He was there every day, sitting by Jessica's bedside, holding her hand, talking to her even though she was unconscious. To everyone at the hospital, he seemed like a devoted husband going through the worst moment of his life. But there were some things that didn't quite add up. When social workers tried to get more information, insurance details, emergency contacts, next of kin, Warren was vague. He said Jessica didn't have any family, they'd moved around a lot. He didn't have much paperwork on hand, and when police started investigating the hit and run, trying to piece together what happened that night, Warren's story kept changing. First he said Jessica had called him to pick her up from work. Then he said she usually took a cab. Then he said maybe she'd been walking. One of the nurses noticed something else. The little boy, Michael, seemed terrified of Warren. When Warren left the room, Michael would relax. When he came back, the kid would tense up, go quiet, avoid eye contact. 5 days after the accident, Jessica Williams died from her injuries. She never regained consciousness. She never got to say goodbye to her son or tell anyone what really happened that night. And that's when the investigation took a very strange turn. Police needed to notify Jessica's family about her death. They needed to track down relatives for the funeral arrangements. So they ran her fingerprints through their databases to see if they could find any additional information. What they found was impossible. According to their records, Jessica Williams didn't exist, at least not the Jessica Williams lying in that morgue. The social security number Warren had given them belonged to a completely different person, a child who died in infancy decades ago. So if she wasn't Jessica Williams, who was she? Detectives started digging deeper. They looked into Warren Williams' background and hit another wall. His social security number? Also stolen from a dead child. His driver's license? Fake. His birth certificate? Forged. Warren Williams wasn't real either. Police brought Warren in for questioning. At first, he stuck to his story, but when confronted with the evidence, the fake IDs, the stolen social security numbers, the inconsistencies, he finally started talking. His real name, he said, was Raymond Novak, and the woman in the morgue? She wasn't his wife, she was his daughter. When Raymond Novak told investigators that Jessica was his daughter, not his wife, you'd think that would clear things up. It didn't. It made everything so much worse. Detectives started pulling on that thread, and the whole sick tapestry started to unravel. Raymond claimed his real name was Raymond Novak and that he'd been using the alias Warren Williams for years. He said Jessica, or whatever her real name was, had been with him since she was a child. He claimed he'd raised her, taken care of her, that they'd been moving around the country together for decades. But here's where it got really disturbing. When pressed about their relationship, Raymond's answers were all over the place. Sometimes she was his daughter. Sometimes he said he'd adopted her. Sometimes he'd slip and call her his wife. The lines were so blurred it was clear something deeply wrong had been going on. Police contacted the FBI. They needed to figure out who this woman really was and what exactly Raymond Novak had done to her. Investigators started going through old photos they'd found in Raymond's apartment. There were pictures of Jessica as a teenager, as a young woman at different ages. In some photos, she was with Raymond. In others, she was alone or with the little boy, Michael. They also found high school yearbooks. In one of them, from a school in Georgia, there was a girl who looked just like Jessica, but her name was listed as Linda Marshall. Was that her real name? Linda Marshall? Detectives tracked down the high school and started interviewing teachers and former classmates. And that's when they started getting answers. Horrible, heartbreaking answers. Yes, students remembered Linda Marshall. She'd been a straight A student, incredibly smart. She'd won a full academic scholarship to Georgia Tech. Everyone thought she was going places. But Linda had always seemed sad, quiet. She lived with her father, at least that's who she said he was. A man named Raymond who was way too controlling, way too possessive. Linda never had friends over, never went to parties. She'd show up to school sometimes with bruises. One of her friends from the time, a woman named Patricia Chen, remembered something chilling. Linda had worked part-time at a local diner and she'd become friends with one of the other waitresses there, a woman named Cheryl Gomez. Right before Linda and her father suddenly moved away in early 2000, Cheryl Gomez disappeared. She'd been scheduled for a shift at the diner, never showed up, and was never seen again. Her car was found abandoned near the airport. Police had investigated Cheryl's disappearance at the time but never found any leads. It was treated as a missing person case that went cold. But now, looking back with fresh eyes, detectives wondered, had Raymond Novak been involved? Had Cheryl known something she shouldn't have? Had she asked too many questions about Linda's home life? The investigation expanded. FBI agents started tracking Raymond's movements over the years. They found records showing he'd lived in multiple states under multiple aliases. And everywhere he went, he had a young girl with him, always calling her his daughter, always isolating her, always moving on before anyone could ask too many questions. But they still didn't know the biggest question. Who was she really? DNA analysis was ordered. Detectives ran the victim's DNA through every database they could access. And finally, they got a match to a missing child case from 1985. Her real name was Jennifer Severson. Jennifer had been kidnapped from a shopping mall in Oklahoma City when she was just 6 years old. Her mother, Dorothy Severson, had been frantically searching for her for nearly 20 years. Missing person reports, private investigators, years of hoping, praying, and eventually grieving. When FBI agents showed up at Dorothy's door in 2003 to tell her they'd found her daughter, Dorothy's first reaction was relief. After all these years, Jennifer was alive, but then they had to tell her the rest. Jennifer had been found, but she was dead. She'd spent the last 18 years living under false names, controlled and abused by the man who'd abducted her. She'd never had a chance to escape. She'd never been able to come home. And the child Jennifer had with her, little Michael, DNA tests revealed he was Jennifer's son. But when police asked Raymond about Michael's father, he refused to answer. The implications were too disturbing to fully comprehend. Dorothy Severson was devastated. She'd lost her daughter twice, once to an abduction and now to death. She'd never get to hold her again, never get to hear her voice, never get to tell her how hard she'd fought to find her. With Jennifer's real identity confirmed, investigators turned their full attention to Raymond Novak, or whoever he really was. Because here's the thing, Raymond Novak wasn't his real name either. That was just another alias. Detectives went back through decades of records. They tracked down old arrest records, military files, anything they could find. And slowly, they pieced together the real identity of the man who destroyed Jennifer Severson's life. His actual name was Franklin Delano Floyd, and he had a criminal record that went back over 40 years. Franklin Floyd had been in and out of prison since the 1960s for various crimes: robbery, assault, parole violations. But his most disturbing conviction was from 1973 when he'd kidnapped and sexually assaulted a young girl. He'd served time for that, been released, and then promptly disappeared into a new identity. That's when he'd abducted 6-year-old Jennifer Severson from that mall in Oklahoma City in 1985. For nearly 2 decades, Franklin Floyd had held Jennifer captive under various identities, moving from state to state. Always staying one step ahead of the law, he'd enrolled her in schools under fake names. He'd isolated her from anyone who might help, and he'd abused her in ways that are almost too horrible to detail. When Jennifer got older, Floyd had forced her to work as a dancer in strip clubs, places where she had contact with other people but was too afraid to ask for help. He'd convinced her that if she ever tried to leave or tell anyone the truth, he'd hurt the people she cared about. He'd hurt her son. And Cheryl Gomez, the waitress who'd disappeared. Investigators now believed Floyd had killed her. Cheryl had been getting too close to Jennifer, asking questions about her home life. Floyd couldn't risk her figuring out the truth. But here's where the hospital surveillance footage became crucial. Remember that footage from the emergency room the night Jennifer was brought in? Investigators went back and reviewed every second of it. They watched Floyd's behavior, how he interacted with the staff, how he handled Michael, what he said and when he said it, and they noticed something. In the waiting room, before he was told Jennifer had died, Floyd made a phone call. The audio wasn't clear, but investigators brought in specialists to analyze it. They discovered Floyd was making arrangements, not for a funeral, but for leaving town. He was already planning his next move, his next identity. Even more disturbing, traffic cameras near the hospital captured Floyd's car on Highway 19 around the time of Jennifer's accident. He told police he was home with Michael when it happened, but the footage suggested otherwise. Had Floyd deliberately hit Jennifer with his car? Had he staged it to look like a hit and run? When confronted with this evidence, Floyd's story fell apart. He'd already been caught in dozens of lies, and now police had physical proof placing him at the scene. Floyd was arrested and charged with Jennifer's murder. He was also charged in connection with Cheryl Gomez's disappearance, though her body had never been found. But the story didn't end there. While Floyd was in custody awaiting trial, he finally confessed to even more crimes. He admitted to kidnapping Jennifer in 1985. He admitted to forcing her into a life of captivity and abuse. He admitted that Michael was his son, the result of years of sexual abuse. And then he revealed something that made investigators' blood run cold. Michael wasn't his only child with Jennifer. Years earlier, Jennifer had given birth to 2 other children. Floyd had forced her to give them up for adoption, telling her that if she ever tried to find them or tell anyone the truth, he'd kill them. Those children were still out there somewhere, living their lives, having no idea who their mother really was or what she'd endured. The trial for Franklin Delano Floyd began in late 2004. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the traffic camera recordings, the DNA evidence, the testimony from Jennifer's high school friends, the records of Floyd's criminal history, all of it painted a picture of a predator who'd gotten away with unspeakable crimes for decades. Floyd's defense tried to argue that Jennifer's death was truly an accident, that he'd just panicked and lied about his identity because he was on parole and shouldn't have been driving. Nobody bought it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The conviction of Franklin Delano Floyd brought some justice for Jennifer Severson, but it could never undo the horrors she'd endured. Dorothy Severson attended every day of the trial. She sat in that courtroom and listened to testimony about what her daughter had suffered, about the life that had been stolen from her, about the brilliant, kind young woman Jennifer could have been if she'd been allowed to grow up free. At Floyd's sentencing hearing, Dorothy read a victim impact statement. Through tears, she talked about the day Jennifer was taken from her at that mall, how she'd turned her back for just 1 second, how she'd searched everywhere, screamed Jennifer's name until her voice gave out. "I never stopped looking for my baby girl," Dorothy said. "And when I finally found her, it was too late. He took everything from her, her childhood, her education, her future. He took my daughter from me twice." Michael, Jennifer's son, was placed with loving relatives who would raise him with the truth about his mother. Not as the woman with no name, but as Jennifer Severson, a survivor who did everything she could to protect him. Jennifer's other 2 children were eventually located through adoption records. They were given the choice to learn about their biological mother's story. It was traumatic for everyone involved, but they deserved to know the truth. The case led to significant changes in how law enforcement tracks missing children and investigates cases of long-term abduction. Jennifer's story became a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes the people we're looking for are hiding in plain sight, trapped by fear and manipulation. Franklin Delano Floyd was convicted on the following charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault of a minor, identity fraud, and tampering with evidence. He received a death sentence for Jennifer's murder, plus multiple consecutive life sentences on the remaining charges. Cheryl Gomez's family finally got some closure when Floyd confessed to her murder in 2007, though he never revealed where he'd buried her body. Floyd died in prison in 2023, taking many secrets to his grave. Jennifer Severson deserved so much more than the life she was given. She deserved to be a kid, to use that scholarship to Georgia Tech, to watch her children grow up in safety and love. Instead, she spent nearly her entire life as a prisoner, living under stolen names, never truly free. Her mother, Dorothy, created a foundation in Jennifer's memory to help other families of missing children. Because Dorothy knows something that no parent should ever have to learn. Sometimes the people we love most are closer than we think, crying out for help in ways we can't hear. Rest in peace, Jennifer Severson. You are finally home. You are finally free.